If you want to hear about what the Wendigo did in another Stephen King novel after the events of Pet Sematary, then stick around to the end of this video. Hello and welcome to Horror History. My name is Professor CZsWorld, or whatever the heck you want to call me. Today's lesson is about the Wendigo, the ancient creature that haunts the cursed burial ground beyond the Pet Sematary in Ludlow, Maine. Stephen King's Wendigo is based off of an Algonquian mythological creature, but in the novel, it is attributed to a different Native American tribe located near eastern Canada and the northeast United States known as the Micmac tribe, which is spelled like this in the book. Probably a reflection of how Judd Crandall might have pronounced it.
This was their burial ground.
Whose burial ground?
Micmac Indians.
But this is how it's spelled in real life. Here are a few pronunciation videos that I found.
Micmac.
Okay, so now I know how a robot would pronounce it, but let's try to find the human version.
Micmac.
Micmac.
So, the Wendigo Legends told of a huge bipedal creature around 15 feet tall. Some versions of the legend tell of a more human-like form, while others skew more beast-like. But all seem to have a few features in common. They're extremely thin from starvation, to the point where you can see their skeleton poking through the skin, all Eugenia Cooney style, or even wasting away to the point where the skeleton is just exposed. They typically have a stag's head and antlers, often claw-like hands, a wretched smell of decaying flesh, and patches of fur stained with human blood. This is because the legend is told as a metaphor for greed, consumption, and starvation in times of famine, as a way to scare away tribesmen from taboo ideas such as cannibalism. Some versions of the legend tell of humans who were overtaken by greed turning into Wendigos, or in the case of Pet Sematary, those who came into contact with the Wendigo would become cannibals. Let's explore the life of the Wendigo as depicted in the universe of Stephen King's novels. The first mention of the Wendigo dates back to pre-1600s when the creature came across the Micmac burial ground in Ludlow, Maine. The Wendigo used its demonic powers to curse the ground, and the tribe soon discovered that any corpse buried there would be brought back to life by the Wendigo. Those who have witnessed these reanimated corpses claim that they can understand some truth behind the stereotypical depiction of a zombie in popular culture, because the corpses would come back as a shell of their former selves with evil intentions to inflict physical and psychological harm to all of those that they came in contact with, including the consumption of human flesh. The Micmac tribe came to understand this new dark power that pulsed through their resting place and abandoned it sometime before settlers arrived in the 1820s. What I would have done if I were them is forget about all this cannibalism stuff, just change my name to the Big Mac tribe and open my own burger restaurant, McMacDonald's, and there's a guy just up the road who'd love to be the mascot. Ludlow became a small agricultural community, so a main road was established to send crops out to be sold on the markets. The Wendigo continued to stalk the woods on the north side of this road, and its insatiable hunger continued to build. At the very end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, the road became more of a truck route as automobiles were becoming more and more prevalent, which made it a very dangerous place, with truckers seeing it as an open stretch of country road to blow through despite the fact that there were families situated on that road. Some say the Wendigo had something to do with the reckless behavior of these drivers, because it had some kind of evil influence within a certain radius of the ground that it soured. Drivers have reported a sudden urge to drive fast when crossing over into Ludlow and not being able to pinpoint why. This led to an increasing amount of deaths from pets who had wandered into the road and been struck down by these trucks. For this reason, the kids of the town established a pet cemetery in the woods, and I personally think it's no coincidence that this location was chosen just shy of the Micmac burial ground. I'd guess that the Wendigo's influence manipulated these kids to choose this location. At some point, someone climbed over the deadfall on the edge of the pet cemetery and ventured through the swamp and into the cursed grounds to bury their pets. It's not clear who was the first person to bury a pet there, but those who did received some kind of curse from the Wendigo, and they'd almost always end up showing a friend or loved one the power of the burial ground. The animals who were buried there would be revived by the Wendigo and come back with the stink of the ground they were buried in, and were usually meaner or more violent towards other small animals and sometimes humans. However, reviving pets who met their fate too early was not seen as a horrible offense because they lacked the ability to communicate with humans, so the psychological attacks were not a factor. It's just a good thing they didn't bury Scooby-Doo, Brian from Family Guy, Garfield, Stimpy, Courage, Meowth, Detective Pikachu, Lucy, even though he's not technically a cat, Charlotte from Charlotte's Web, and for the love of God, the Cat in the Hat. By the time Judd Crandall's dog Spot died in 1910, a boy named Stanley B had already discovered the burial ground secret and passed it on to Judd. When Spot was reanimated by the Wendigo and came back from the dead the next day, Judd's father was hardly surprised. It seemed that he too knew of the burial ground's power, although it's unclear if that was from experience or if he had just heard about it. He warns his son not to go back to the cursed ground again, and Judd agrees. He keeps this promise for many years until one fateful day when the Wendigo lures Judd back to the burial ground. Spot lived on another 4 years after that, and despite a couple of small incidents, was mostly the same, despite being horrifying to Judd's mother.
Judd, come and get your dog! He stinks to the ground you buried him in!
But the cycle continued for years, and it was mostly kept a secret by the town's locals. At one point, a man named Lester Morgan tried to revive his prized bull, Hanratty. It's not entirely known how he managed to lug the massive corpse all the way up to the burial ground on a sledge, but it is implied that he received some help from the Wendigo. When Hanratty came back, his possession by the Wendigo was particularly nasty. He would charge at anything that moved, animals, people, even trees swaying in the breeze, to the point that his horns were broken and his head was bleeding. Lester had to put Hanratty down once again to spare any additional damage. The Wendigo continued possessing animals buried in the place beyond the Pet Sematary until 1941, where a young Ludlow man named Timmy Baterman was killed during World War II. Should have stayed home and played Apex Legends, Timmy my man. His body was sent back to Maine for his funeral, but his father, stricken with grief, buried his body in the burial ground, the first known human burial since the Micmac days. The Wendigo brought Timmy back and possessed him to scare the townsfolk, who all believed that Timmy was dead. People started to notice him walking along the roadside with a blank look, and gossip of his return spread faster than a Shane Dawson conspiracy. Okay, maybe not that fast. Got a little carried away there. The Wendigo used its knowledge of everything that has happened in the town to torment those he interacted with, divulging their most embarrassing secrets and making horrible threats to some of the women in town. Timmy's father ended up going insane from his undead son's constant torture and burned down the house with both of them inside. The next major incident took place in the 1980s, over 70 years since Judd buried his dog Spot for the first time. Judd had just befriended the Creed family, who had moved in across the street from him. When the family's cat was run down in the road, Judd took Lewis Creed to bury the cat in the Micmac burial ground, finally breaking the promise to his father that he would not go back there. Judd believed that he never meant to show Lewis the cursed place, that the power of the Wendigo made him do it. And by introducing Lewis to the soured grounds, he transferred the curse to Lewis's family. Not long after, the young boy Gage ran into the street and was killed. I mean, freaking yeeted by an oncoming truck. A tragedy that Judd felt he was partially responsible for because he showed Lewis the burial ground. The Wendigo has the ability to influence those within a certain radius of the cursed ground, and for the next 2 days, it constantly puts ideas about digging up Gage and putting him in the Micmac grounds into Lewis's head. Lewis sends his remaining family away to visit his wife's parents in Chicago, claiming that he needs to wrap some things up at work before he joins them. This gives him the privacy he needs to retrieve his son and take him up past the Pet Sematary and over the deadfall towards the forbidden burial ground. His wife Rachel senses that something is wrong and travels back to Maine on a string of last-second flights, but after just missing the last flight, she's unable to get there on time. She talks on the phone with Judd, who realizes what is happening and tries to stay up and wait out for Lewis, hoping to talk him out of this despicable act. Despite not being tired at first, Judd quickly starts to doze off and recognizes that the Wendigo is doing this to him to try to clear any obstacles in Lewis's path. Judd does everything he can to stay awake, but in the end passes out before Lewis arrives. As Lewis approaches the cemetery, the fog around him goes into a swirl and encloses him. He feels that the swamp around him is alive and sentient. When the mist clears, Lewis sees a pair of yellow-gray eyes before him. A spirit with rotting teeth, the curved horns of a ram, and peeling flesh was laughing in the distance before him. As Lewis trudged on after that, the face floated before him at a constant distance until it eventually faded back into the mist. The frogs and insects of the swamp go quiet as a huge creature shakes the ground with its footsteps and approaches Lewis. A vile smell fills the air as the monster gets closer to him. As it reaches its closest point, Lewis looks up and sees the sparks of a pair of yellowish eyes some 60 feet above him. The Wendigo, knowing Lewis is headed to the Micmac grounds, lets Lewis pass as it continues going north. As Lewis continues, he comes across a massive claw-like footprint and forces himself to believe that it was something else to keep himself from going insane. Lewis buries his son in the cursed burial ground, goes home, and goes to bed. During the night, the Wendigo goes ahead and revives Gage, who kills both Judd Crandall and Rachel. Lewis discovers their bodies in the morning and goes crazy after seeing what the monster had done to his wife. But the last sane thought that crosses through his mind is the image of the Wendigo in the swamp that previous night. As he heads up the forest path with Rachel's body, Lewis's physician's assistant, Steve Masterton, sees him disappear over the deadfall, presumably passing on the knowledge of the burial ground once again to feed the Wendigo's insatiable hunger with a new set of victims. It's unknown what happened to the Wendigo from then until almost 15 years later, in the summer of 1997. Actually, it's not really confirmed that the Wendigo comes back at all, but there are many people who believe that an evil deity from Stephen King's novel The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon is in fact the Wendigo from Pet Sematary. I don't personally think there's enough evidence to draw this conclusion, but there are some points that I find interesting anyways. The story is about a 9-year-old girl named Patricia McFarland, who goes missing while hiking with her mom and her brother on the Appalachian Trail in eastern Maine. The area she first gets lost in isn't very close to the woods that the Wendigo prowl in Pet Sematary, but if you continue down the Appalachian Trail, it does continue to go towards Ludlow, so it's possible that the Wendigo traveled this stretch of the woods after destroying Lewis Creed's family. After getting separated from her family and lost from the path, Tricia continues down along the stream to try to find some civilization, and she notices some disturbing signs along the way, like a tree that's been slashed by some giant claws and a decapitated deer, which is maybe the strongest evidence towards this creature actually being the Wendigo, considering that Wendigo are most often depicted with a stag's head. The further into her journey she gets, the more the voice in her head tells her that this thing is following her. At some point, Trish starts to hallucinate some strange images, and it's not entirely clear if it's real or if it's in her mind. She comes across a trio of robed figures in the form of her history teacher, her father, and the God of the Lost, the creature that has supposedly been following her and watching her. Its head appears to her in the form of one of her fears during the journey, a swarm of wasps. After several days, she finally makes it out of the wilderness to a road, and the God of the Lost comes for her in the form of a bear-like creature. But she and the hunter who helps her scare off the deity are never quite convinced this is an actual bear, and both seem to have an idea in their heads that it's actually something supernatural. It could be the Wendigo, or it could be some wild creature that was revived by the Wendigo and is now being controlled by it. Personally, I just don't see a lot of strong connections between the two, and I'd have to say maybe they're related entities at best. Just as the Wendigo in the Algonquian folklore was used to warn against taboo behaviors such as cannibalism, the Wendigo in Stephen King's stories warns against tampering with the natural order of life. In Pet Sematary, the Wendigo tempts a doctor who's lost his son to defy nature to bring him back after being unable to resuscitate one of his patients earlier in the story. In this sense, it's very similar to the classic horror story Frankenstein, because in trying to create life, this doctor ends up creating a monster. The Wendigo represents the taboo, that line that should never be crossed by any man. It is an evil force, an embodiment of those things that go against nature. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon also contains themes of man versus nature, or at least 9-year-old girl versus nature, but they're conveyed in a much more positive way, with Tricia defying nature by overcoming seemingly impossible odds to survive. So that wraps up today's lesson here on horror history. Your homework is to like this video and let me know what your thoughts are on the Wendigo and the God of the Lost in the comments. Are they the same? Are they related? Or are there just similar themes that tie them together? I'll be looking forward to your responses. Check out the video on the left for 47 things you might have missed in the 1989 Pet Sematary movie adaptation, and if you're a fan of Stephen King, you're definitely going to want to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week. Ring that death bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one, assuming we both survive.